In the spring of 4851, flames consumed the county records office in Bowford County, South Carolina. Thanks to the quick efforts of clerks and volunteers who created human chains to pass leather, bound ledgers from hand to hand, the majority of documents were rescued. However, one particular set of records, already pulled aside for examination by a visiting state auditor, remained untouched inside a locked iron safe, which shielded them from both the fire and the water used to extinguish it. When that safe was finally unsealed 3 days afterward, the auditor, William Prescott, retreated to a makeshift office and continued his review of the materials he had been studying before the blaze interrupted his work. These were the plantation books belonging to the Ashford family, spanning 41 years of meticulous entries. Their precision, their methodical nature, and their unflinching honesty regarding life within the Ashford estate were so striking that Prescott would later describe the experience as confronting evil that had mastered the art of keeping flawless accounts. At the heart of these ledgers was a woman named Celia, born into slavery in 1810. By 1851, over 3 decades, she had delivered 14 children. Each child was fathered by a different generation of the same white family, beginning with the plantation owner, Marcus Ashford, followed by his son Robert, and later by Robert's son James. 3 generations bound by one woman's body, used as a bridge between them. Every birth, every transaction, and every deliberate decision was recorded in handwriting that became more assured with each successive generation. Prescott had traveled to Bowford County to evaluate tax assessments, anticipating routine figures, tobacco harvests, property valuations, and standard plantation finances. Instead, he encountered what amounted to a confession penned by men who saw nothing to confess. The Ashford ledgers did not conceal their actions. They documented them with the same diligence afforded to rainfall data and crop schedules, as though 40 years of systematic sexual exploitation was merely another aspect of agricultural management deserving proper documentation. The pages Prescott examined that spring unveiled something historians would later find difficult to label. It was not just isolated acts of brutality, which were tragically common under slavery, but a deliberate, multi-generational endeavor. Each Ashford male, upon reaching adulthood, was introduced to Celia as part of his education in mastery. Fathering children with the same enslaved woman became a rite of passage, linking grandfather to grandson, a tradition as carefully maintained as the family's silver or land deeds. What set these records apart from countless other plantation documents was their directness. Most enslavers who exploited enslaved women maintained strategic silence in their official paperwork. Births were recorded without fathers. Mixed-race children appeared in inventories without explanation. The violence occurred in shadows everyone recognized, but no one wrote down. The Ashfords chose differently. They recorded it. They dated it. They cross-referenced it. They treated the systematic abuse of one woman as information worthy of preservation. Prescott sat in that temporary office, reading by lamplight while Bowford County rebuilt around him, realizing he was holding evidence of something the law sanctioned but morality condemned. Evidence that would compel any reader to confront a question. What does it mean that this was legal? That 3 generations could use one woman's body with absolute impunity, document every instance with pride, and face no consequence beyond the judgment of a God they claimed to serve. Before we explore further what those records exposed about Celia's life and the men who regarded her as property across 4 decades, I want to ask you something. If you believe stories like this demand to be told, if you think American history cannot be understood without confronting its darkest truths, then subscribe to The Sealed Room. hit that notification bell. These are the narratives textbooks avoid. The documented horrors that unsettle people, precisely because they are irrefutable. And please leave a comment, letting us know where you are watching from. We want to understand where our audience stands when faced with these truths. The Ashford Plantation occupied 200 acres along the Coo River, where the Lowcountry geography of South Carolina offered ideal conditions for rice farming. By 1810, when our narrative begins, the Carolina Lowcountry had cultivated a distinctive form of slavery unlike other regions. Rice plantations demanded specialized knowledge, grueling labor in malaria-ridden swamps, and a task system that shaped how enslavers managed their human property. The Ashford family had established their holdings in the 1780s, amassing wealth across 3 generations of rice production, sustained entirely by enslaved labor. Marcus Ashford inherited the plantation in 1808 at 26, following his father's death from yellow fever. He assumed control of an enterprise that enslaved 117 individuals, maintained extensive irrigation networks, and produced rice commanding premium prices in Charleston markets. Marcus had been educated at what would later become the University of South Carolina, traveled to England as a young man, corresponded with agricultural reformers, and studied treatises on scientific farming. He brought to plantation management a particular blend of intellectual sophistication and moral blindness characteristic of many educated enslavers. His wife, Catherine, hailed from another prominent Lowcountry family. They married in 1809, and she brought a dowry that included enslaved individuals and additional land. The marriage was successful by the standards of their class. Catherine managed the plantation household efficiently, supervised domestic enslaved workers, maintained social connections with neighboring plantation families, and bore Marcus 4 children between 1810 and 1818: Robert, Elizabeth, Thomas, and Anne. Among the enslaved people Marcus inherited was a girl named Celia, born on the Ashford plantation in 1810. The records note her mother as a field worker who died in childbirth, while her father is listed as unknown. However, the notation, Bright, next to Celia's name in the slave inventory, suggested mixed ancestry from birth. Celia was reared in the plantation quarters by women who cared for enslaved children while their mothers labored in the rice fields. She survived childhood diseases that claimed many enslaved infants. By age 8, she had been moved to work in the main house, a transition that removed her from the deadliest plantation labor, but placed her under the direct supervision of the Ashford family. The household dynamics of a Lowcountry plantation created a particular proximity between enslaved domestic workers and the white family. Celia would have served meals, cleaned rooms, carried water, tended fires, and moved through the private spaces of the main house daily. She would have been constantly visible to Marcus, present in ways that field workers were not. Young and vulnerable in an environment where Marcus held absolute legal authority over her body and future. The first entry appears in Marcus Ashford's personal journal in August 1826. Unlike the plantation's main ledgers, which tracked rice production and enslaved people's births and deaths in columns and numbers, Marcus kept a separate journal where he recorded observations about plantation management, experiments with rice varieties, and thoughts on maintaining discipline and productivity. This journal, discovered by Prescott in 1851, contained passages Marcus never intended for outside scrutiny, but preserved nonetheless. Celia has matured into a useful house servant, Marcus wrote in August 1826. She shows intelligence in learning tasks and maintains proper deference. At 16, she represents increasing value as property, though her utility extends beyond typical domestic service. I have determined that certain arrangements, while not openly discussed, serve multiple purposes in plantation management. The girl understands her position. She has been instructed clearly. These matters require discretion, but not apology among men who understand the realities of our situation. The language was coded, but unmistakable. Marcus was documenting his decision to begin sexually exploiting Celia. The entry's tone combined self-justification with assumed entitlement, framing his actions as arrangements and utility, transforming rape into a management decision. The phrase, "she understands her position," carried particular cruelty. Celia had no choice. Understanding meant only that she had been informed of what would happen and knew resistance was futile. Celia was 16. Marcus was 44, married, father of 4, a respected member of the planter class, and an elder in the Presbyterian Church. The legal system of South Carolina granted him absolute authority over Celia. She could not refuse him, report him, or escape. If she became pregnant, the child would be his property, adding to his wealth while testifying to his crime in features everyone would see, but no one would officially acknowledge. The plantation's main ledger recorded the first consequence in May 1827. Celia delivered of a daughter, healthy, light complexion, named Sarah. No father was listed. The omission was standard practice, but in this case deliberate. Marcus chose not to acknowledge paternity in the business records, even while documenting his actions in his private journal. This separation suggested awareness that what he was doing required some concealment, even in a society that broadly tolerated such exploitation. Over the next 7 years, 3 more children appeared in the ledgers, all born to Celia, all listed without fathers, all described with terms like bright or light, that indicated mixed ancestry obvious to anyone who saw them. Marcus's journal contained occasional references to these births, noted with the same tone he used for successful rice harvests or the purchase of new farm equipment. "Celia has proven reliably productive," he wrote in 1829. "The children represent appreciating assets, while serving immediate household needs as they mature." The dehumanization was complete. Celia existed in Marcus's accounting as a production unit. Her children were assets. Their suffering was irrelevant to calculations of utility and value. Marcus recorded these observations in permanent ink, confident they would never bring consequence because the law and society both protected his right to do exactly what he was doing. Robert Ashford, Marcus's eldest son, was 17 in 1827 when Celia gave birth to her first child. He grew up in a household where his father's exploitation of an enslaved woman occurred openly enough that everyone knew, yet quietly enough that no one spoke of it directly. This was the world that shaped Robert's understanding of power, manhood, and what it meant to own other human beings. Marcus invested considerable attention in Robert's education. The boy was sent to Charleston for formal schooling between ages 12 and 16, studying classics, mathematics, and the agricultural sciences valued by wealthy planters. But his real education occurred at home, watching his father manage the plantation, learning through daily observation how authority functioned in a world built on slavery's absolute hierarchy. He learned that enslaved people existed for white convenience, that their bodies could be used in whatever ways served the master's interests, and that this was not just permissible but natural, ordained by God, and protected by law. Marcus's journal from 1833 contains an entry revealing how deliberately he approached passing these lessons to his son. Robert returns from Charleston next month, nearly 23, and ready to assume greater responsibilities in plantation operations. I have determined to educate him fully in all aspects of management, including those arrangements that maintain proper order and satisfy natural requirements. The boy has romantic notions from too much reading, but practical experience will correct these. He must understand that effective mastery requires exercising all forms of authority, not merely those discussed in polite company. The language was careful, almost bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Marcus intended to introduce Robert to the systematic sexual exploitation he had been practicing with Celia for 7 years. This was not casual mention or indirect suggestion. Marcus planned to teach his son that using enslaved women sexually was part of plantation management, a practice to be learned and continued across generations. The main plantation ledger recorded what followed in February 1834. Celia delivered of a son, healthy, fair complexion, named Daniel, father Robert Ashford. Unlike the previous births, this entry included paternity. Marcus made the choice to document his son's actions explicitly, creating an official record that linked Robert to Celia and her child. The notation suggested pride rather than shame, acknowledgement rather than concealment. Marcus was documenting a tradition successfully transferred to the next generation. Celia was 24. She had already borne 4 children to Marcus. Now his son, barely older than some of her earlier children, had been directed to her as part of his education in mastery. The journal entries from this period contain no record of Celia's experience, no acknowledgement of her humanity, no consideration of what it meant for a woman to be systematically passed between father and son like inherited property. The records preserved facts while erasing every element of human suffering those facts represented. Robert's own journals, which he began keeping in 1834 following his father's example, show a young man initially struggling with something that troubled his conscience, before gradually accepting it as normal. An early entry from March 1834 reads, "Father instructs me in matters I find difficult to reconcile with Christian teaching. Yet he demonstrates through Scripture that proper order requires firm authority in all things. The Negro woman Celia serves purposes beyond household work, and I am told this arrangement is common among well-managed plantations, though not discussed openly. I must learn to see property as property, not as persons who might claim rights they do not possess." The entry reveals Robert's internal negotiation, his attempt to rationalize what he knew was wrong by accepting his father's framework. Within a year, his journal entries had shifted tone entirely. By 1835, he wrote about Celia with the same casual ownership his father displayed, the same reduction of a human being to utility. The moral struggle had been resolved by embracing the logic of slavery so completely that exploitation became management and rape became prerogative. Catherine Ashford, Marcus's wife and Robert's mother, lived through all of this in the main house, where Celia worked and bore children that increasingly resembled the Ashford men. The historical record offers only fragments of Catherine's perspective. Occasional letters to relatives that reference Plantation carefully coded language. In one letter from 1835, discovered in family papers decades later, Catherine wrote to her sister in Charleston, "Domestic arrangements here follow patterns common to our region, though I confess they trouble my Christian conscience. Yet what authority do I possess to object? The law grants my husband absolute discretion in managing his property, and my role is to maintain household order, not to question his decisions in matters beyond my influence." The letter captured the complicity built into plantation society, particularly for white women who benefited from slavery's wealth while lacking power to challenge its practices. Catherine saw what was happening. She understood that Celia's children bore Ashford features, that Marcus and now Robert were exploiting an enslaved woman under her own roof. But she framed her silence as powerlessness, her inaction as proper feminine deference to male authority. This was how the system sustained itself, through layers of participation and complicity extending beyond the direct perpetrators. The 1830s and 1840s brought significant changes to the Ashford plantation's operations and structure. Rice prices fluctuated with international market pressures. Marcus experimented with new irrigation techniques and expanded the plantation's acreage through purchases of adjacent properties. The enslaved population grew through both natural increase and strategic purchases at Charleston auctions. By 1840, the Ashford plantation enslaved over 200 people, making it one of the larger operations in Bowford County. Celia's children were growing up during these years, occupying an ambiguous space in the plantation hierarchy. They were clearly mixed race, obviously related to the Ashford family, yet still enslaved and subject to the same absolute authority as any other enslaved person. Sarah, the eldest, worked in the main house alongside her mother. Daniel, Robert's acknowledged son, showed intelligence that Marcus noted in ledgers as increasing his future value. The younger children learned various tasks, their assignments determined by assessments of their capabilities and the plantation's needs. Robert married in 1838 to Margaret Porter, from a prominent Savannah family. She moved to the Ashford plantation, and her presence complicated household dynamics in ways the records hint at, but never fully explain. Margaret certainly encountered Celia and her children. She certainly noticed Daniel, who by age 4 bore unmistakable resemblance to her husband. A letter from Margaret to her mother in Savannah, dated 1839, mentioned finding plantation life more complex than anticipated, with arrangements that require adjustment to sensibilities formed in city environments. Despite his marriage, Robert continued the pattern with Celia that his father had established. The ledgers show 3 more births between 1839 and 1843, all documented as Robert's children with Celia. Marcus's journal entries from this period expressed satisfaction with his son's management abilities and noted approvingly that Robert had learned to handle all aspects of plantation operations without squeamishness or excessive sentiment. Marcus Ashford's health began declining in 1844. At 62, he suffered from respiratory problems and recurring fevers common to Lowcountry residents who had spent decades in malarial regions. As his condition worsened, he spent increasing time organizing his papers and preparing for the transition of authority to Robert. His will, drafted with assistance from a Charleston attorney in early 1845, disposed of his property according to careful calculations. The plantation and most enslaved people would go to Robert as primary heir, with provisions for Marcus's daughters and younger son. Specific clauses addressed Celia and her children. They were to remain together, assigned to Robert, with a notation that these individuals represent significant accumulated property value that would be diminished by separation, and their continued presence serves established plantation functions. The language was deliberately vague, but the meaning was clear to anyone who understood the situation. Marcus was ensuring that the arrangement he had created and passed to his son would continue after his death. Marcus died in August 1845, leaving Robert as master of the Ashford plantation at age 35. The transition was smooth. Robert had effectively managed operations for years under his father's guidance. He continued the meticulous record-keeping Marcus had established, maintained the rice cultivation techniques that produced consistent yields, and preserved the systematic documentation that treated enslaved people as inventory requiring precise accounting. And he continued the pattern with Celia, now 35 herself. She had already borne 10 children across 19 years. Her body showed the cumulative damage of continuous pregnancy, childbirth, and unrelenting domestic labor. A traveling doctor who visited the Ashford Plantation in 1846 to treat Catherine's illness noted in passing that one of the house servants appears worn beyond her years, moving with difficulty, though she continues her duties with admirable persistence. The observation was clinical, detached, absent any recognition that Celia's condition resulted directly from decades of systematic exploitation. This blindness characterized how white Southerners trained themselves to see enslaved people. They could notice suffering without acknowledging its causes, observe consequences without questioning the system that produced them, and document facts while remaining willfully ignorant of meanings those facts revealed. Robert's son, James, was born in 1841, the first child of Robert's marriage to Margaret. As young James grew from infant to child, he was cared for partly by enslaved women in the household, including Celia's daughters. The irony was stark but unremarked. The white child, heir to the plantation, was being tended by his father's children through an enslaved woman. His own half-siblings, who would never be acknowledged as such and existed in his world as property rather than family. By 1848, Celia had borne 12 children, 6 to Marcus between 1827 and 1833, and 6 to Robert between 1834 and 1848. 2 generations of Ashford men had used her systematically across 22 years, documenting each birth with the same careful attention they gave to rice harvests and equipment purchases. The children ranged from 21-year-old Sarah down to an infant born that spring. Several had themselves begun having children, adding to the plantation's enslaved population, creating a network of families whose origins testified to decades of sexual violence that everyone saw but no one officially acknowledged. The late 1840s brought tensions to South Carolina that would eventually culminate in secession and war. Though no one yet understood where events were leading, debates over slavery's expansion into Western territories intensified. Northern abolition movements gained strength despite fierce Southern resistance. Some enslavers worried about the institution's future, while others insisted that slavery would endure permanently, protected by constitutional guarantees and economic necessity. Robert's journals from this period show a man increasingly defensive about his way of life, increasingly insistent that slavery benefited both masters and enslaved people, and increasingly convinced that outside criticism came from ignorant meddlers who understood nothing of Southern society. He wrote extensively about enslaved people being naturally suited to bondage, about the Bible sanctioning slavery, and about the plantation system creating civilized order out of African barbarism. The entries revealed someone constructing elaborate justifications for a system he benefited from and refused to question. Nowhere in these self-justifying passages did Robert acknowledge Celia as human. Nowhere did he consider whether his children with her experienced pain or confusion about their status. Nowhere did he reflect on the moral implications of a pattern where his own son was growing up in a household shaped by the same exploitation. Robert had learned from his father. The blindness was complete, sustained by ideological frameworks that made slavery's defenders immune to recognizing their own cruelty. James Ashford was 7 years old in 1848, an age when children begin understanding their world structure and their place within it. He was being raised to inherit the plantation, educated in the responsibilities of mastery, taught to see enslaved people as property, whose management required firmness and strategic thinking. Robert involved his son in plantation tours, explaining rice cultivation, demonstrating authority, and modeling the behaviors that would prepare James to eventually take control of operations. And James was learning through daily observation the unspoken rules governing relationships between white men and enslaved women. He saw Celia and her children. He heard conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He absorbed assumptions about power, race, and gender that would shape his understanding of what masters were entitled to expect from those they enslaved. The pattern was preparing to repeat into a third generation. The 1850s arrived with South Carolina more deeply committed to slavery than ever before. Despite growing national tensions over the institution's future, the Compromise of 1850 had temporarily eased sectional conflicts. But debates continued to intensify. In Bowford County, where enslaved people outnumbered white residents by overwhelming margins, the planter class maintained its authority through laws that grew increasingly harsh and a culture that demanded absolute loyalty to the slavery system from every white person. Regardless of their actual power or wealth, Robert Ashford had become one of the county's prominent planters by this time. At 40, he managed a thriving operation that produced rice commanding premium prices in domestic and international markets. He held positions of respect in local government and the Presbyterian Church. He corresponded with other planters about agricultural innovations and political strategy. To outside observers, he represented the success and stability of the plantation system, a man who had inherited wisely and managed effectively. The fire that swept through Bowford County's records office in March 1851 might have destroyed all evidence of what occurred on the Ashford plantation. Had those particular ledgers not been locked in an iron safe for audit review, William Prescott, the state auditor who had been examining them, returned to his work after the fire with a sense that something beyond ordinary providence had preserved these specific documents. His initial review had already troubled him. Now, continuing through the later volumes, he discovered that the story he thought he understood was still unfolding. Prescott found entries showing that Celia had borne 2 more children since 1848, bringing her total to 14 across 24 years. Her health had deteriorated significantly, noted in Robert's journals with the detached concern one might show for aging equipment. Celia increasingly limited in her capacities. Robert wrote in 1850, "The years of service have accumulated effects, though she remains useful in lighter duties. Her daughters now assume primary household responsibilities, continuing the family's reliable service." The phrase, "continuing the family's reliable service," carried layers of meaning that Prescott found deeply disturbing. Robert was noting that Celia's daughters, now young women, were taking over the domestic work their mother could no longer perform as efficiently. But the phrasing also suggested something more ominous. A continuation of the service that had defined Celia's entire adult life. Prescott turned to the ledgers, tracking births among the enslaved population. What he found there made him set down his pen and close his eyes for a long moment. Sarah, Celia's eldest daughter, born in 1827 to Marcus Ashford, had given birth herself in 1850. The entry was clinical. Sarah delivered of a daughter, healthy, light complexion, named Grace. Father, Robert Ashford. Robert had fathered a child with his own daughter. The girl born to him and Celia 23 years earlier had been used by him, exactly as her mother had been used by Marcus, and then by Robert himself. The pattern was not just continuing across generations of Ashford men. It was expanding to include the daughters born from previous exploitation, creating a web of abuse that grew more complex and horrifying with each new entry Prescott examined. But even this was not the full scope. As Prescott continued reading through Robert's journals and the plantation ledgers, he discovered entries documenting something he initially struggled to believe. James Ashford, Robert's legitimate son, had turned 18 in 1859, and in the spring of that year, just months before Prescott arrived to audit the records, The ledger contained a new entry. Celia delivered of a daughter, healthy, fair complexion, named Ruth. Father James Ashford. 3 generations. Marcus had used Celia starting in 1826. Robert had used her starting in 1834. And now James, the grandson, had continued the pattern in 1859. Celia had borne children to grandfather, father, and grandson across 33 years. She was 49 years old when she gave birth to Ruth, her 15th child, fathered by a young man she had known since his infancy. The son of Robert, the grandson of Marcus, continuing a tradition of exploitation that had consumed her entire adult life. Prescott sat alone in that temporary office, surrounded by ledgers that documented what should have been unthinkable, but was instead carefully recorded, cross-referenced, and preserved as plantation business. He read Robert's journal entry from March 1859, written shortly before James's 18th birthday. I have determined to educate James in the full scope of his responsibilities and privileges as master of enslaved property. My father performed this service for me, and I now undertake it for my son. The boy must understand that authority includes dimensions not discussed in church or at table, but essential nonetheless to maintaining proper order. Celia, though aged, serves this educational purpose as she has served the family throughout her years here. The entry's tone was matter of fact, almost pedagogical. Robert was describing his decision to direct his 18-year-old son to rape a 49-year-old enslaved woman as casually as he might describe teaching James to evaluate rice quality or manage field labor. The systematic nature was undeniable. This was not exploitation occurring haphazardly or opportunistically. It was a deliberate tradition, consciously passed from generation to generation, with Celia's body serving as the vehicle for teaching young Ashford men what it meant to possess absolute power over other human beings. James's own journal, which he had begun keeping upon his 18th birthday, following family tradition, contained entries that showed the same trajectory his father had experienced decades earlier. Initial discomfort gradually overcome by acceptance of the framework that made exploitation seem natural. Father instructs me in matters I find difficult at first to comprehend as part of Christian mastery, James wrote in April 1859. Yet, he explains that sentiment must not prevent necessary exercises of authority. The Negro woman Celia has served 3 generations of our family, and this continuity demonstrates proper management of human property. I am learning to think correctly about these things, setting aside notions that would weaken the resolve required of men in our position. Within months, James's tone had shifted completely. By the end of 1859, he wrote about plantation management, including the arrangements with enslaved women, using the same casual language of ownership his father and grandfather had employed. The moral education was complete. James had been taught to see Celia and other enslaved people as objects for use, their humanity erased by legal frameworks and social customs that defined them as property. Prescott discovered more as he read deeper into the recent records. James had not limited his attention to Celia. Several of her daughters, including Sarah and others born to Marcus and Robert, appeared in entries suggesting James was continuing the pattern with them as well. The exploitation was expanding systematically, the 3rd generation building on foundations the first 2 had established, creating layers of abuse that became increasingly difficult to track as the family trees grew more complex through births resulting from rape across decades. The spring of 1850 had brought another development that revealed how thoroughly the Ashford family had normalized this systematic exploitation. Robert's younger brother, Thomas, who had inherited a smaller neighboring property from Marcus's estate, visited the main plantation regularly. Thomas's journal, which Prescott found filed with family papers, contained an entry from May 1850 expressing envy of Robert's advantageous arrangements with reliable house servants, and noting his intention to establish similar efficiency on my own property by studying Robert's methods. The language was coded but clear. Thomas admired the systematic sexual exploitation his brother practiced and wanted to replicate it. The Ashford pattern was not contained within one household. It was being recognized by extended family as a model worth copying, a management technique that could be discussed in abstracted language that avoided naming what was actually being described. Margaret Ashford, Robert's wife, remained present through all of this, maintaining the household, raising her children, and managing the social obligations of a prominent planter's wife. Her letters from the 1850s, few of which survived, showed a woman who had long since made peace with arrangements she had initially found troubling. A letter to her sister in 1851 mentioned that plantation life requires accepting practices common to our region, and I have learned that domestic harmony depends on not examining too closely those matters that fall within my husband's authority to manage as he sees fit. The acceptance was complete. Margaret had resolved whatever moral discomfort she initially felt by embracing the same willful blindness that characterized the entire planter class. She lived in a house where her husband had children with an enslaved woman, where her son had been taught to do the same, and where the evidence of systematic sexual violence surrounded her daily in the faces of Celia's children and grandchildren. She had trained herself to see none of it, to maintain the fiction that these were simply standard plantation arrangements, requiring no acknowledgement or examination. Celia herself remained absent from the records as a human being with thoughts, feelings, or experiences worth documenting. Everything written about her reduced her to property, production, utility. Whether she experienced these decades as continuous trauma or had found some way to psychologically survive by disconnecting from her own suffering. Whether she loved her children or resented them as products of violation, whether she maintained hope for eventual escape or freedom, or simply endured one day after another until death might release her. None of this appeared in any document Prescott examined. The records preserved only facts, births, dates, fathers acknowledged with pride rather than shame. They documented systematic exploitation across 3 generations while erasing every trace of the humanity being exploited. Celia existed in the Ashford ledgers as an entry in inventories, a name attached to births, a piece of property whose decades of service were noted with the same tone used for describing productive livestock or durable equipment. By 1851, when Prescott conducted his audit, Celia had survived 25 years of being used by Marcus, 17 additional years of being used by Robert, and was now being used by James. She was 51 years old. She had borne 15 children to 3 generations of Ashford men. She had grandchildren who were also her children, creating genealogical tangles that the ledgers tracked for property purposes while ignoring their human implications. She had spent her entire adult life as the vehicle through which Ashford men learned mastery, her body treated as an educational tool and productive asset, her suffering irrelevant to calculations that measured only utility and value. The plantation records showed that several of Celia's children had been sold in the late 1840s, when Robert needed cash for expansion projects. They appeared in ledgers as transactions. Sold to Colonel Peyton of Edistu Island, the Negro boy David, age 14, for $850. David was one of Robert's sons with Celia. The sale separated him from his mother and siblings permanently, sending him to labor on another plantation where his origins and family connections meant nothing. The transaction was recorded in the same columns that tracked sales of rice and purchases of equipment. One more economic calculation in the endless accounting that slavery required. Other children remained on the Ashford plantation, growing into roles determined by assessments of their capabilities and the operation's needs. Some worked in fields. Some maintained irrigation systems. Some, particularly the daughters, served in the main house alongside Celia when she was still capable of such work. All of them lived with the knowledge of their origins, understanding that they existed in an ambiguous space between family and property, sharing blood with their masters while remaining subject to the absolute authority that allowed those masters to use them in any way they chose. Prescott found himself reading faster now, driven by a need to reach the end, to see if there was any recognition of wrongdoing, any moment where someone in the Ashford family acknowledged the humanity they had been systematically violating for decades. But there was nothing. The journals ended with James's entries from early 1851, documenting plantation operations, rice prices, weather conditions, and the continued useful service of Celia and her daughters. Routine observations about routine matters requiring routine management. The horror was precisely in that routine quality. The Ashford family had committed systematic sexual violence across 3 generations and documented it with the same casual precision they applied to tracking tobacco yields and equipment maintenance. They had treated rape as a management technique, exploitation as tradition, and continuous abuse of one woman and her daughters as simply one more aspect of the plantation economy, requiring proper record-keeping. And it was all legal. Every act Prescott read about in those ledgers was protected by South Carolina law. Enslaved people could not refuse their masters. They could not testify against white people in court. They had no right to bodily autonomy. They were property, and property owners could use their property as they wished. The Ashford family had done nothing illegal. They had simply documented with unusual thoroughness what countless other enslavers practiced without creating such detailed records. Prescott closed the final ledger and sat in silence as afternoon faded toward evening outside. He was a state auditor tasked with assessing property values for tax purposes. His authority extended to verifying numbers and ensuring proper documentation. Nothing more. He had no power to prosecute crimes that were not crimes under state law. He had no authority to free enslaved people whose bondage was legally sanctioned. He could not rescue Celia or her children or undo 3 decades of systematic exploitation. But he could create a record. He could document what he had found in official reports filed with state authorities. He could ensure that somewhere, someone would know that this happened, that evidence existed, that one auditor in 1851 had read the Ashford ledgers and recognized the horror they contained. William Prescott spent 3 days drafting his report in that temporary office, while Bowford County rebuilt around him. He wrote and rewrote, struggling to find language that would convey what he discovered without seeming hysterical or overstepping his authority as a state auditor. The final version included his standard property assessment, land, buildings, enslaved people, equipment, all valued according to South Carolina's formulas for taxation purposes. But attached was a separate document, 12 pages long, marked, Findings Requiring State Review. In this attachment, Prescott detailed what the Ashford ledgers revealed. He cited specific dates and journal entries. He traced the pattern from Marcus to Robert to James. He documented Celia's 15 children across 3 years, born to grandfather, father, and grandson. He quoted directly from the journals where Ashford men described their deliberate education of each new generation in what they called proper mastery. He provided evidence for every claim, building a case not for prosecution, which was impossible under existing law, but for historical record. His conclusion was carefully worded. These documents reveal practices that, while legally permissible under current statutes, demonstrate systematic exploitation across generations that raises profound questions regarding the moral foundations of property rights as currently defined. The explicit documentation by the perpetrators themselves, preserved with evident pride rather than shame, suggests that legal frameworks permitting such conduct require examination by those with authority to consider whether laws that enable multi-generational sexual violence against enslaved women serve the interests of justice or merely the convenience of those who benefit from such arrangements. Prescott knew. Language was bold, potentially dangerous for a state employee in South Carolina in 1851. But he also knew that someone needed to say clearly what the records proved. That slavery enabled systematic rape, that enslavers documented their crimes with confidence that law and society would protect them, and that 3 generations of one family had used one woman's body and then her daughters' bodies as vehicles for teaching young men what absolute power looked like in practice. He submitted the report to the state auditor's office in Columbia on April 3, 1851. The response came 3 weeks later. State Auditor General James Henderson acknowledged receipt of Prescott's property assessment, which was filed as routine documentation. But the attached findings were returned to Prescott with a brief note. Your observations regarding the Ashford family's private affairs exceed the scope of tax assessment responsibilities. Such matters, if they raise concerns, should be addressed through appropriate channels by parties with standing to bring suit. As a state auditor, your role is to verify property valuations, not to offer commentary on the lawful exercise of property rights by South Carolina citizens. The message was clear. Prescott's attempt to create an official record had been rejected. The state had no interest in examining what the Ashford ledgers revealed. Henderson's reference to lawful exercise of property rights made explicit what everyone already understood. Slavery gave enslavers absolute authority, and any sexual violence that occurred within that framework was legally protected, officially unacknowledged, and deliberately beyond the reach of government intervention. Prescott was ordered to return to Bowford County to complete his routine tax assessment work, instructed to submit a revised report containing only standard property valuations without editorial commentary, and quietly warned that continued attempts to use his position to challenge slavery's legal foundations would result in termination and possible prosecution for exceeding his authority. He complied. Prescott submitted the requested revised report in May 1851, documenting the Ashford plantation's value in columns of numbers that revealed nothing about how that value had been generated or what suffering it represented. But before returning the Ashford ledgers to the county records office, now rebuilt after the fire, he made copies of key passages. He spent his own money to have a clerk transcribe sections of Marcus's, Robert's, and James's journals, along with the relevant birth entries from plantation ledgers. These copies he kept, storing them in his personal papers with a note explaining their significance. I cannot stop what occurs on the Ashford plantation, Prescott wrote in that note, dated May 15, 1851. I cannot free Celia or her children. I cannot prosecute men who have committed no crime under South Carolina law. But I can preserve evidence that this happened, documented by the perpetrators themselves, so that if history ever develops eyes to see what we currently choose to ignore, these records will testify to truths that our generation lacks courage to acknowledge. Prescott left South Carolina, shortly after completing his work in Bowford County. He relocated to Pennsylvania, finding employment with a shipping company in Philadelphia, far from the plantation economy, whose legal protections for systematic abuse had cost him his career for simply documenting what he had found. He carried those copied documents with him, preserving them among his personal papers, uncertain whether they would ever matter, but unwilling to let the evidence disappear entirely. Back on the Ashford plantation, life continued its established patterns. Robert managed rice cultivation with the efficiency his father had instilled. James learned plantation operations, gradually assuming more responsibility as Robert prepared him for eventual inheritance. Celia, now in her 50s, performed what work she remained capable of, her body worn beyond recovery by decades of childbearing and labor. Her children and grandchildren moved through roles determined by the plantation's needs and the Ashford family's assessments of their capabilities. The 1850s brought increasing sectional tensions that would culminate in war, though in 1851 few anticipated how drastically everything would change within a decade. South Carolina's planter class remained confident in slavery's permanence, in constitutional protections and economic necessity that would preserve the institution indefinitely. The Ashford family, like their neighbors, invested in expansion, purchased additional enslaved people at Charleston auctions, and planned futures built on assumptions that the system, enabling their wealth and authority, would endure unchanged. Celia died in November 1854 at age 44. The cause listed in plantation records was simply illness. No details, no diagnosis, no acknowledgement that her body had been destroyed by 3 years of continuous exploitation. Robert's journal entry noting her death was brief. The Negro woman Celia expired yesterday after extended decline. She served 3 generations of our family with reliable productivity. Her numerous offspring continue useful service, representing significant accumulated property value and demonstrating effective management principles. A replacement house servant will be purchased at the next Charleston auction. The tone was clinical, transactional, completely absent any recognition of Celia as a human being who had suffered across decades of systematic violence. Robert noted her death, the way he might note the loss of productive equipment, regrettable from a property standpoint, but requiring only practical adjustment. The phrase, "served 3 generations of our family," carried meanings Robert apparently saw no need to examine or acknowledge. Celia was buried in the Enslaved People's Cemetery on the Ashford Plantation, a clearing beyond the rice fields where wooden markers deteriorated in low country weather and humidity. No stone marked her grave. No service acknowledged the specific circumstances of her life. The enslaved community buried her with whatever ceremony they could manage within the limited time and resources available to them, marking her passing in ways the historical record does not preserve. Her children remained enslaved on the Ashford property or on neighboring plantations where some had been sold. Ruth, the youngest, born in 1850 to James Ashford, was 4 years old when her mother died. She would grow up knowing Celia only through stories told by older siblings, learning her own origins from people who had lived through what Ruth would only hear described. The family Celia had borne through violence continued carrying forward into generations that would eventually experience freedom, but would never fully escape the trauma embedded in their genealogy. The Civil War arrived in 1861, 7 years after Celia's death. Robert Ashford was 51, too old for combat service, but deeply committed to the Confederate cause. He contributed money and supplies to military units, and the plantation provided rice to feed Confederate soldiers. James, now 20, served briefly in a South Carolina regiment before being sent home to manage plantation operations essential to the war effort. The Ashford family, like the broader planter class, fought desperately to preserve the system that had enabled their wealth and maintained their authority. The war came to Bowford County in late 1861, when Union forces captured Port Royal Sound and established one of the war's most extensive occupied territories. White planters fled inland, abandoning their properties in panic. Robert and James Ashford left in November 1861, taking portable valuables but leaving the plantation itself, the enslaved people, and most records behind. They never returned. Both died during the war years, Robert from illness in 1863, James from wounds received at Petersburg in 1864. The enslaved people on the Ashford plantation experienced Union occupation as the beginning of freedom. Though the transition was complex and uncertain, federal authorities established the Port Royal Experiment, one of the war's first major efforts at transitioning from slavery to free labor. Formerly enslaved people began working land for wages, establishing schools, building churches, and creating the institutional foundations of free black communities in the Lowcountry. Among those who experienced this transition were Celia's surviving children and grandchildren. The records from this period are fragmentary, but some evidence exists of their post-emancipation lives. Sarah, the eldest, appears in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1866 as a teacher in one of the schools established for formerly enslaved people. She was 39, teaching children to read using materials provided by Northern missionary societies. Whether she ever spoke about her own origins, about being born to Marcus Ashford and then used by Robert Ashford, about the father-grandson pattern that had defined her family's experience across generations. The records do not preserve. Other children scattered after emancipation, leaving the Lowcountry entirely or moving to Charleston and other cities where they might build lives disconnected from plantation origins. Many changed their names, a common practice among formerly enslaved people who wanted to establish identities separate from the families who had owned them. Whether any of Celia's descendants retained the name Ashford or chose different surnames to sever linguistic connection to their exploiters remains unclear from available documentation. The Ashford plantation property went through various hands after the war. The main house, abandoned in 1861, gradually deteriorated. Reconstruction, era economic instability, and the collapse of rice cultivation in the Lowcountry made large plantations difficult to maintain. By the 1880s, much of the former Ashford property had been subdivided and sold, some portions to formerly enslaved people who purchased small plots, others to speculators hoping for eventual recovery of land values. The physical landscape that had contained Celia's entire life slowly transformed. The buildings collapsing, the fields reverting to marsh and forest. The evidence of what had occurred, their eroding into the Lowcountry soil. The ledgers and journals survived, preserved initially in the county records office, where William Prescott had returned them in 1851. They remained filed as routine plantation documents, examined occasionally by researchers studying Lowcountry agricultural history or genealogists tracing family lines, but their full significance largely unrecognized. The journal's explicit descriptions of systematic sexual exploitation were read by various people over the decades, usually producing discomfort that led to quick refiling rather than deeper examination. Prescott's copied transcripts remained in his personal papers in Philadelphia. He lived until 1889, working in shipping and commerce, never returning to South Carolina. His papers were donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania after his death, including the transcribed passages from the Ashford ledgers along with his explanatory notes. These sat in archival storage for decades, one collection among thousands, their contents unknown, except to the occasional researcher who examined Prescott's papers for other purposes. The first serious historical examination of the Ashford case occurred in 1932, when a graduate student at the University of South Carolina, researching plantation record-keeping practices, discovered the original ledgers in Bowford County's historical collections. Margaret Thornhill was studying how enslavers documented the people they held in bondage, examining the bureaucratic systems that reduced human beings to inventory entries. The Ashford ledgers stood out immediately for their unusual explicitness about sexual exploitation. Thornhill spent months working through the documents, cross-referencing the journals against birth records, tracing Celia's children through multiple generations, and documenting the pattern that connected Marcus to Robert to James. Her master's thesis, completed in 1933, provided the first scholarly analysis of what the records revealed. She wrote carefully, using academic language that sometimes obscured the violence she was describing, but her core argument was clear. The Ashford family had practiced and documented systematic multi-generational sexual exploitation with a thoroughness that revealed how deeply such practices were embedded in slavery's structure. The thesis attracted attention from other historians studying slavery, but broader public awareness remained limited. Academic historical work in the 1930s reached relatively narrow audiences, and discussions of slavery's sexual dimensions remained controversial, even in scholarly contexts. Many white Southerners still defended slavery as benevolent or necessary, resisting any examination that challenged romantic narratives about the Old South. Thornhill's work was filed in university archives, cited occasionally by other researchers, but largely unknown beyond specialists. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s gradually created space for more honest examination of slavery's realities. As Black Americans fought for basic rights and white supremacist violence was broadcast nationally, the mythology of benevolent slavery became harder to maintain. Historical scholarship increasingly emphasized slavery's brutality, its sexual violence, and its systematic dehumanization. The Ashford case began appearing more frequently in academic works, examining enslaved women's experiences under slavery's absolute authority. By the 1970s and 1980s, historians studying slavery had developed frameworks for understanding cases like Celia's. They documented how sexual exploitation functioned as a tool of control, how enslaved women's bodies were treated as property available for masters' use, and how laws that defined enslaved people as property, rather than persons, enabled systematic rape with complete legal protection. The Ashford ledgers provided unusual documentation of patterns these historians knew were widespread, but rarely so explicitly recorded. Modern understanding recognizes that Celia's experience, while extraordinarily well documented, was not exceptional in its basic dynamics. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women was endemic to slavery across the Americas. What made the Ashford case distinctive was the multi-generational nature, deliberately passed from grandfather to father to grandson, and the meticulous documentation that preserved evidence, typically hidden in strategic silence. The records force confrontation with realities that most enslavers took care not to document so explicitly. The Ashford plantation site today is barely recognizable as having once been the center of a major rice operation. The land is partly occupied by a nature preserve with walking trails through what were once cultivated fields. Some portions remain in private hands, undeveloped land where Lowcountry forests have reclaimed territory that slavery's forced labor had transformed. No historical marker notes what occurred there. South Carolina's historical marker program which has installed hundreds of plaques across the state, has not erected one at the former Ashford property. The Enslaved People's Cemetery, where Celia was buried in 1854, has been lost entirely. No maintained markers remain. No clear boundaries define the space. Coastal erosion and vegetation growth have obscured whatever evidence once existed. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1990s identified some possible grave locations through ground penetrating radar, but no excavation has occurred, and no specific graves can be definitively identified. Celia's burial place exists somewhere in that landscape, unmarked and forgotten, except in the records that documented her exploitation while erasing her humanity. The descendants of Celia's children, now scattered across multiple generations and likely numbering in the hundreds, almost certainly know nothing of their ancestors' story or their connection to the Ashford family. The genealogical documentation that might trace those lines has been lost or was never created. Emancipation's chaos, the destruction of Freedmen's Bureau records, name changes, and the general lack of attention to Black genealogy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries all contributed to severing connections between Celia's descendants and knowledge of their origins. Some descendants of the Ashford family still live in South Carolina, though the connection to the Plantation era family is distant now through multiple generations. Whether any possess knowledge of what Marcus, Robert, and James documented in those ledgers, whether family oral history preserved any acknowledgement of the pattern that defined the Ashford Plantation's operation for 3 decades, remains unknown. Most likely, the white descendants are as ignorant of this history as the Black descendants. Separated by time and deliberate forgetting from truths their ancestors either experienced or perpetrated, the Ashford ledgers and journals remain preserved in various archival collections. The originals are housed at the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston, available to researchers but rarely examined. Prescott's transcribed copies reside at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, filed among his papers. Digital scans have been created in recent years, making the documents more accessible to scholars, though public awareness remains limited. What does this story demand from us? The Ashford case is not ancient history. Celia died in 1854, just 170 years ago. People alive today have great-grandparents who were born closer to her death than to the present moment. The legal system that protected Marcus, Robert, and James Ashford's systematic exploitation was built on frameworks of white supremacy that did not end with emancipation, but transformed into Jim Crow segregation and ongoing racial inequalities that shape American society today. The documentation exists. The evidence is preserved. We know what happened on the Ashford plantation because the perpetrators wrote it down with confidence that law and society would protect them. They were correct. No one stopped them. No one prosecuted them. No one even officially acknowledged what they were doing until William Prescott tried in 1851 and was silenced by authorities who had no interest in examining slavery's realities. Does knowing this history create obligations? Should descendants of enslaved people and descendants of enslavers both confront these documented truths about how their families were connected through systematic violence? Should communities where such plantations existed acknowledge what occurred there, mark the sites, and teach the history to students who need to understand what slavery actually entailed beyond sanitized textbook descriptions? These questions remain contested. Many Americans prefer comfortable distance from slavery specifics, acknowledging it was wrong in abstract terms, while avoiding the documented details that reveal how thoroughly it corrupted everyone it touched. The Ashford ledgers force confrontation with specifics. They name names, provide dates, and preserve the perpetrator's own words, justifying systematic rape as plantation management. They make denial impossible for anyone willing to actually read what Marcus, Robert, and James Ashford wrote. Celia existed. She lived 44 years, bore 15 children to 3 generations of men who treated her as property, and died without ever experiencing freedom or justice. Her story was nearly erased, preserved only because an auditor in 1851 had the moral courage to document what he found despite knowing it would cost him his career. We owe it to her memory and to all the enslaved women whose exploitation was never documented so explicitly to tell these stories. To refuse the comfortable forgetting that lets us pretend slavery was something less brutal than the records prove it was. If this story affected you, if you believe these truths matter, then share this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts about what obligations we have to confront documented history. Subscribe to The Sealed Room for more stories that reveal the realities textbooks often skip. These are difficult histories, but difficulty does not excuse ignorance. The records exist. The evidence is preserved. We choose whether to look at it honestly or continue the willful blindness that protected slavery and its aftermath for so long. The story of Celia and the Ashford family is not exceptional because it is unusually horrific. It is exceptional because someone documented it. How many other enslaved women experienced similar systematic exploitation across generations, but left no records because their enslavers practiced strategic silence? How many stories remain unknown because the evidence was never preserved? Because those who could have documented them chose not to, or because the records that existed were destroyed by fire, neglect, or deliberate erasure? We cannot answer those questions, but we can answer one. What will we do with the evidence we have?